So for a deeper dive on performance gaps in today's neonatology care system, we've assembled a distinguished panel of experts to talk about neonatal care advancements and current performance gaps. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and I'll ask you to come up and sit on our shiny white couch here. Our first guest comes to us from Sweden via India, Anne Granelli. Anne Granelli is a biomedical scientist with a PhD in medicine who spent many years at the Queen Silvia Children's Hospital in Gothenburg, Sweden. Dr. Granelli is an internationally recognized expert in screening for critical congenital heart disease. Anne, thank you so much for coming, and please join me up here on the stage. Our next panelist is Dr. Augusto Sola, and he, starting tomorrow, will be a Vice President of Medical Affairs for Neonatology for Massimo, and Massimo is happy to have him join our team. Augusto also has an international reputation, and he's been a professor of pediatrics at Buenos Aires University Medical School, the University of California, San Francisco, the University of California, Los Angeles, and Emory University. Augusto, thank you so much for joining us and everything that you do for babies. Thank you so much. Great to have you here. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is, you heard a little bit about already, and she's an incredible woman, Anne-Marie Sarin, and she called me one time and told me about the work that she's doing, and I was just so impressed what she does. And she's the founder of the Newborn Coalition and the chairman of that group. Anne-Marie, thank you so much for coming. Our next guest is local. He's a pediatric cardiologist, Dr. Antony Chang. He's the medical director of the Children's Hospital of Orange County Children's Heart Institute, and he's also the division chief of CHOC's Children's Specialist in Cardiology. Dr. Chang. I'm not sure where he is. And finally, our moderator of our panel is really another distinguished neonatologist named William Tarnell Morty, and he comes to us from Sydney, Australia, so he came a long way to be here as well. He's a professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and neonatology at Westmead Clinical School, and he's also the clinical director for neonatal studies at the University of Sydney. He advocates for training patients as full research partners with clinicians in achieving healthy survival for newborns through international perinatal trials. As I said, he's the moderator for our session, and William, thank you so much for coming so far to be with us. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's begin. Do take a seat. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm really grateful to Joe and to the committee for including neonatology in this extremely important and exciting movement. I think neonatology is something that touches everybody. We've already heard from Cora's mum, and we've seen an illustration of that. What I'm going to do is begin by a short session. Yep, thanks very much. A short session just to introduce the topic, about 10 minutes of slides. And then I'm going to go to our panel and to ask each of them to comment on the work that they've done, which I will have referenced in the slides. So if I begin by pressing the green button, I presume that's the correct one. And the first question is, why is neonatal safety important? And I think we've already seen some answers to that, but one of the reasons is that it touches every family, it touches every geographic country, it touches every socioeconomic stratum. And the other reason, of course, is that what happens in the first few hours and the first few days of life can have lifelong effects. I mean, when we get disability that's preventable, it has enormous costs, first for the family, for the child, but also for society. And so getting it right in neonatology, not only avoiding error, but implementing evidence rapidly once we have reliable evidence, is going to make an enormous difference both to the families and to society. And I want to just remind ourselves that, can go back with that, that this is the 50th year after the death of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who is the youngest child of President J.F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, who died aged 2 days of respiratory distress syndrome. in 1963. And in those 50 years since then, there have been enormous advances both in avoiding medical error, not that medical error played any part in his death, but particularly in advancing our knowledge of appropriate treatment. And it's now the case that had that little boy been born today, his chances of survival, applying what we know now through randomized trials and other advances, would be 99%. So today we're going to talk about two performance gaps. The first we've already been introduced to, which is the issue of detecting and preventing death from critical congenital heart disease. And just to put that in context, I think a minimum estimate of the incidence of critical congenital heart disease is 130,000 cases per year. And then we're going to talk about the topic of oxygen targeting, which in many ways is a more complicated topic because it's a much more variable issue, but it also has important implications for disability-free survival in babies that should be under 28 weeks gestation. And they represent about 900,000 births globally per year. So if we look at misdiagnosis of critical congenital heart disease, some important seminal work comes from one of our distinguished guests, Antony Chang. And just to summarize that, this was published in 2008, and he looked at 15 years' worth of data in the California State Registry of deaths from critical congenital heart disease. And he accumulated 898, and he found out that about 152 of them and 299 were of missed or presumed late diagnosis, respectively, and that those two accounted for more than half of the deaths. That equates to about 10 misdiagnoses in California alone per year, and 20 deaths due to presumed late diagnosis in California. And we'll hear a little bit more from Antony about the implications of those figures. And if we extrapolate those figures, both the United States and worldwide, what we see is that there would be about 2,000 missed or late diagnoses of critical congenital heart disease in the United States every year, and about 65,000 globally, worldwide. So the stakes are very high, particularly when you marry that cold statistical information with the impact that we've heard about already from Cora's mom. Now, the story begins in many ways with this extremely important data, which is accumulated by a team led by Dr. Granelli, another of our distinguished guests. And this is published in the BMJ in 2009. And it was a Swedish study in nearly 40,000 normal-term babies, in which they looked prospectively at the impact of detecting critical congenital heart disease due to ductus-dependent congenital heart disease using pulse oximetry. I'm just going to summarize that data. They used signal extraction technology, which is motion tolerant. They found a detection rate of ductus-dependent congenital heart disease of 92%, and there were no missed diagnoses leading to death at all in that cohort. They had most of the babies screened between 24 to 72 hours of age, and the false positive rate was incredibly low, 0.17%. And I think those two final statistics are linked with each other. More recently, we've had another major study from the United Kingdom, and this is by a colleague of mine, Andrew Ure, whom I know very well. He worked in Australia as a senior registrar before he went back to Birmingham, where he's now a consultant neonatologist. And they did the Pulseox study, which looked at 20,000 babies prospectively in the Birmingham area, doing the same thing, using the same technology, exactly the same technology, signal extraction technology, motion tolerant, accurate in low perfusion states. And they screened most of their babies in the first 24 hours, because in the United Kingdom, the majority of babies go home before they're 1 day old. And not surprisingly, because of that, the false positive rate was higher. It was 0.8%. But that's not bad news by any means, because in fact, a lot of those false positives were in fact respiratory disease, pneumonia, and other urgent non-cardiac cases. And it was very good that they were detected in the first 24 hours, because much less harm would come to those babies by early diagnosis and intervention. So those are two major studies accounting for nearly 60,000 babies, 50,000 babies in two European countries outside the United States. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, one of the issues that is important, I think, in determining policy, and if you come from outside the United States, this may be something that you'll think about, is the impact of false positive diagnosis on the emotional well-being of the parents. And a lot of people would feel that, of course, if you're told on an initial screen with a pulse oximeter that your baby may have critical congenital heart disease, that's going to be quite traumatic for you. But in fact, as part of the UK study, which I've just shown you, they looked very carefully at a subgroup of 813 mothers. And what they did was to ask those mothers with scaled questionnaires, measuring their anxiety, how they felt. And they found that there was, in fact, no significant difference between the mothers, the 119 mothers who'd been given a false positive diagnosis and then an echocardiogram showing normal anatomy, so it was a false alarm, and the 679 mothers who'd had a true negative diagnosis. And I think that's very reassuring. And in fact, if you read the paper, what they say is that many of the mothers were just reassured that we were taking it seriously, that we were looking for something serious. And even though they had a moment of anxiety, when they got the result very soon afterwards, they felt no problem. And they much preferred to have gone through this process than not. So it's a widely acceptable technique, both in Sweden and the United Kingdom. Now, we come to the important work by the Critical Congenital Heart Disease Work Group, which was set up in the United States, which in many ways has been a model for action worldwide. And they came up with some recommendations in 2010. And in 2011, as you'll see in a moment, the Secretary of State for Human and Health Services recommended implementation of screening. And this paper, which was published about a month after the Secretary of State's recommendations, put into place some strategies, recommended some strategies for screening for critical congenital heart disease, including pulse oximetry monitoring in well infant and intermediate care nurseries, and also the use of motion-tolerant pulse oximeters measuring functional saturation that was cleared by the FDA. And as a result, we have what I think is a historic instruction from the Secretary of Health and Human Services on September the 21st, 2011, which is now being implemented across the United States. And we'll hear a little bit more from some of our experts about how that implementation process is going. But let me say immediately that as a non-United States citizen, as an observer, I'm incredibly impressed by not only the speed with which things have moved since the initial paper by Antony Chang, but also the fact that your government has used evidence from outside the United States, good, high-quality evidence, knows no borders, and has integrated that, some of it even before it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. And I think that speaks volumes about the commitment and the process that we're witnessing that is going to make an enormous difference. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about improved outcomes for better oxygen targeting. This is to do with babies less than 28 weeks gestation. And we have some very dramatic data shown here from the work of Augusto Sola, which is published in Pediatrics in 2003. And what this shows, it's a historical cohort study. It shows a dramatic reduction in severe retinopathy of prematurity in babies under 1,500 grams between the years of 1997 and 2001. And the incidence of grade 3, grade 4 retinopathy fell from about 12.5% to 2.5% within that period. And you can see that the hatched bars are the benchmark group, the Vermont-Oxford Network group of neonatal intensive care units, where the incidence of grade 3, 4 retinopathy did not change. If anything, it increased over the same period. So this had a dramatic effect, and I think it's fair to say it's had quite a contribution to people's thinking and to practice. There was similar data that was published from the United Kingdom and also elsewhere from North America. And so in 2004, most hospitals in the United States and also around the world aimed to keep the saturation measured on pulse oximetry in these very little babies, less than 28 weeks gestation, between 85 and 95%. No randomized controlled trials had compared the effect of the upper versus the lower half of that range. And again, it's a tribute to the impact that Dr. Solar's work has had. It stimulated no less than 5 randomized trials around the world, along with other evidence, to actually answer that question. Is it better to target the lower half of that range, 85 to 89%, or the upper half of that range, 91 to 95%? And this is a historic movement of prospective randomized trials funded in 5 different countries by 5 different agencies, but all coordinated under what's called the NEOPRAM collaboration. All of them using the same pulse oximeters, signal extraction technology, motion-tolerant pulse oximeters, to measure pulse oximetry while these babies were receiving supplementary oxygen. And you'll see that the earliest of those trials was the United States support study, which began in 2005. The latest to start was the UK Boost 2 study, began in 2007. I've just noted in the last column that the calibration algorithm in the oximeters was revised in 2009 for those 3 studies, the Canadian study and the Australian and the UK Boost 2 studies, resulting in even more accurate targeting and better separation in the 2 groups, the low and the high target. Now, in 2010, we had the first trial. All of them were following the same protocol, a very similar protocol, in which babies were randomized to mass study oximeters, which would display either 3% above or 3% below the true saturation between the range of 85 to 95%. And staff were trained to target 88 to 92, so that half of the babies would actually get 85 to 89, and half would get 91 to 95. And outside that range of 85 to 95%, they would get the true displayed SpO2. And in 2010, the first of those studies, the US support study, was published in the New England Journal. And to everyone's surprise, it showed that there was an increased mortality in the low target group, 85 to 89%. This led to immediate scrutiny of the other trials. In fact, all 4 other trials looked at their data, and the 3 boost trials, in fact, pooled their data. And they published shortly afterwards, in 2011, a pooled safety analysis of the interim data for their trials. And that's a complicated slide, but basically, in summary, what it showed was that for all babies, using both the original and the revised algorithm, there was a 20% decrease in mortality by targeting 91 to 95%. And for the babies that had been managed with the revised algorithm, the more accurate targeting algorithm, that was a 60% difference in mortality. And so the recommendation from the result of that safety analysis, published in the same communication in the New England Journal, was that we considered it prudent not to target 85 to 89%, although we did await the primary outcomes of disability-free survival of all the trials. And I'm just going to finish this introduction by reporting to you that 2 weeks ago, again in the New England Journal of Medicine, on December the 27th, the US support trial published its 18 to 22-month follow-up, which again showed the persisting mortality difference favoring the high target, 91 to 95%. There's about a 25% adjusted risk difference, relative risk difference, in favor of the high target. And interestingly, no difference in the primary outcome of death or neurodevelopmental impairment at 18 to 22 months, and no difference in major visual deficit, no difference in severe blindness or blindness in one eye, or nystagmus, or any of those complications of retinopathy. Although there was, of course, more intervention for retinopathy in the high target group that had received more oxygen. That was no surprise. There was twice as much surgery, but the net result resulted in no difference between the 2 groups. And so as a result of that, they concluded that low targets cannot be recommended. And Dr. Eduardo Bancalari from Miami, who's a well-respected commentator in neonatal respiratory medicine, has recommended that most neonatologists will now be using between 90 to 95% as their target range in these very preterm babies to avoid the risk of mortality while protecting against hyperoxemia. So how do we close these gaps? Admittedly, the second gap is still much fresher, and we still have a lot more discussion. But I'd like to suggest that we should be aiming, first of all, for no baby around the world to have the consequences of unrecognized critical congenital heart disease. Secondly, that we should be concentrating our minds very carefully on what is appropriate oxygen targeting for babies under 28 weeks gestation, even as more data come in the next 2 years or so. And thirdly, that we should be looking at establishing active partnerships in not only the implementation of research, but I would recommend in the actual conduct, the design and the conduct and the governance of research. Because let's think of it, if you were trying to do something for women's rights, you wouldn't just go ahead and set up a lot of committees with men in them and then report back to the women. You would actually work out partnerships with the women, and you would find that the women would start to take active leadership roles. And I think we should see patients in the same light. And what we're trying to do in Sydney is to actually train patients to understand the epidemiology, the basics of clinical trials, so that they can join us on equal terms in all aspects of trial design and trial management. So having said that, I'm going to open up the discussion, and I'm going to move immediately to Antony Chang and ask you, Antony, against that background, what do you think are the biggest performance gaps in neonatal cardiology from your perspective?
Well, I think for someone that spent most of his career up to now in the critical care setting, particularly the neonatal intensive care unit, I think by far the most devastating and traumatizing experience for we caretakers on the heart team is to come to the bedside of a neonate that had a delayed diagnosis of congenital heart disease. Because there's often multi-system organ failure that really preempts the possibility of an excellent outcome. Now, if we're lucky, some of the organs will recover in the next few weeks, then we can do palliative or corrective surgery. But the expectation is going to have to be lower because of the multi-system organ failure. So I'm so glad that 2013 are we going to be able to move forward with the screening for pulse oximetry. And as you know, medicine often lags behind technology. This should have been done 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think it is true that sometimes radical changes in medicine take a long time. But I think in 2013, there should be no babies leaving the hospital, particularly now that we're advocating earlier discharges, and no baby should be leaving the hospital without a pulse oximeter reading.
Okay. And how are you addressing that particular issue in your hospital?
Well, I think we are working with the community hospitals trying to implement that. As you well know, a good idea is only a good idea, and you have to execute the plan. And we're trying to set up with different hospitals for a certain protocol to screen the babies for possible critical congenital heart disease.
Great. Anne-Marie, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm going to ask you, what are the biggest performance gaps in neonatal health from the patient advocate perspective, from your perspective?
Well, first I want to thank Dr. O'Reilly. You don't have any assholes in your company, by the way, because I called him 3 years ago, and he picked up the phone and was willing to talk with a random parent from nowhere about something that was really important. And I will be really forever grateful for that. And quite frankly, Dr. Granelli, Dr. Ewer would not be on the federal work group that established what we all know as the protocol that has been federally recommended for all babies without this connection. So thank you to you and to Massimo for that. The gaps that I see in neonatal health start with communication. And I say that having been sort of in the trenches with my own child, and knowing that we had a clinical team of neonatologists, pediatricians, cardiologists, EPs, who am I forgetting, nurses. And I will tell you, maybe not the first week, but there is no one on this planet that knows my daughter's condition or her current state from minute to minute than I do. Parents get smart really fast when it comes to their own children being in trouble. And they need to be included in every possible way in the clinical care process, communicating, like the story we heard earlier about the gentleman whose mother was lost, and the doctors come in and they talk amongst themselves, and you're like trying to decide, like, and you're like, hey, I'm gonna raise my hand, I have something to contribute, I have something to say. The information needs to flow that way, even when we're discharged, right? Because we carry around that Bible of information, how many mLs they're eating every hour or every day, you know, what's their urine output. We record all this stuff. Sure. It needs to be integrated with the electronic health record right now to help improve outcomes for those babies. So communication is first, and then this interoperability of the data is second, I would say, and then just policy. Looking at, you know, what we did in the United States, it worked. So.
And can I ask you what's happened since the US Secretary of State for Health and Human Services recommended pulse oximetry screening?
Well, that was a little over a year ago. And I will tell you, I mean, I work in health IT, I work in public policy for my real job, my day job, before I co-founded the coalition. And this has really moved by federal standards at the speed of light. And that, I know for me, I've got the patience of a gnat, so like every little, extra month it takes to do this or that is difficult. But following the recommendation, I mean, in September of 2011, I think we were sitting at about 0.03% of newborns in this country being screened for heart disease using pulse oximetry. And today we are at 12%. Now, some people might say 1 out of 10 is not great, but I will tell you that is massive progress in 1 year. When we're a country that deals on with state implementations, right? So even if we have a federal recommendation, which is critically important, every state has to adopt of their own volition. So we've had 9 states that have legislatively moved. We've got additional 3 states that have added it statutorily to their panels. They're the panels of what we screen newborns for, with the heel stick. So it's added as a point of care screening. Another 2 that are almost fully implemented just as a standard of care. So almost half of the states in this country in some way have made movement on this in just a year. And with California's adoption on July 1 of this year, that's 550,000 babies. We will be up over 1 million, and that'll put us close to 25%. So that'll be a big boost in the number right in this year.
Fantastic. And how are you seeing hospitals actually address the technology aspects of critical care, congenital heart disease diagnosis? Well,
they've been quite desperate for information, which is, a good thing and a bad thing, right? So you almost wish, I wish you had all this ready-made for you. I know our foundation and our coalition has been working really hard to provide that information to hospitals. We're in the throes of developing a digital resource hub right now, so that administrative teams and clinical teams across the country can just go online and have all these open source documents, information about the protocol, information about technology available to them. And we had to work actually really hard with the CDC to adopt language that included the idea of motion tolerant technology that needed to be used, because a lot of these states are writing their statutory language around what type of technology should be used. So we have some standardization. So we don't have higher false positive rates in one place than another, that we're really using things that can be measurable from both a health economics and an epidemiology standpoint. So, so what we're finding with the hospitals is that they're not finding the implementation of the screening itself for their nursing teams to be difficult at all. The screening takes less than 5 minutes. It's essentially the cost of a diaper change in the newborn nursery. I mean, it's really not expensive. It's very efficient. The thing we're trying to help with, I think, and all hospitals are interested in, is improved kind of workflow and less opportunity for confusion and possible error, all the things we're talking about here today. And I think some of the technology that's being developed now around direct from device capture of the reading, that takes all of these, like, if you're a nurse, pick or choose which, is it 96, is it 94, is it 95, take the middle number. We're trying to take that out of the equation. Right. So it's clinical decision support built into the technology. That will be an incredible step forward, and I know it's very near.
Thanks very much. I'm going to move on to Dr. Granelli. Anne, can I ask you, what did your early work on CCHD screening tell you in terms of its feasibility?
Okay, yeah, well, when I started, there was a lot of interest from different studies as well, but what they all lacked was they were not large enough, didn't have enough numbers to determine the sensitivity, and there were a lack of consistency. They used different measure size, different technologies, different cutoffs. So we wanted to start from the beginning. We didn't want to assume anything. So what we did was we wanted to maximize the sensitivity for this detection. Not prospectively, but we wanted to compare normal newborns with a large group of babies with critical congenital heart disease.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that. You've had the largest and most well-known study. Can you tell us what it showed? What did you find?
Well, we found there is a way. It's a feasible way. if you use the protocol that we came up with in the first study, low false positives, it saves lives. We had a control cohort region where 5 babies died before diagnosis. And with circulatory collapse coming in, returning, risking a long-term morbidity. So what we found, we reduced the risk of leaving hospital from 30% or 28% down to 8%. There is still a slight risk to leave hospital with this diagnosis, but we significantly reduced it by adding.
So translating that into numbers, say, for Sweden, how many lives would that introduction of the screening technique save in Sweden every year?
Well, over a year, I'm not sure. We are not that many in Sweden. That's why it takes a long time. We're 9 million. So, but during the study in the cohort control region, 5 babies died in 4 years.
And so from what you said, you reduced it from about 30% to 8%?
Yes.
So 22%, absolute risk difference.
And that has been confirmed by 3 other European studies using the same technology. So it's not only you will reach 92% detection if you start doing this.
Okay. And of course, some of this is on top of antenatal diagnosis. How does it contribute to the efficacy of antenatal diagnosis?
Well, I wish I have a slide to show you, because we were certain, when we read the papers that suggested that, okay, we know we missed these babies, but we think if you add prenatal scan, you will detect more, and if you add pulse oximetry screening. And I can tell you about the German study, and they had a 60% prenatal diagnosis. And then you would expect that you would at least detect over 80% or between 70 and 80%, which they did not. So having that large prenatal detection did not solve the problem significantly. But what did was adding pulse oximetry screening. So, yeah.
Can I just add a statistic?
Yeah, please.
But I mean, just to put it in perspective, over the time that we're going to be here at this meeting, in the United States, there will be 220 babies born with congenital heart disease, and 22 of them will die in 2 days. And nearly 10 of those are preventable deaths. And they're preventable because they could have been detected earlier and reduced the morbidity mortality. That's in 2 days.
One of the issues, of course, about the introduction of any technology is the cost effectiveness. I'm going to ask all 3 of you to comment on the cost effectiveness of this technology. Anne?
Well, in our study, we tried to do a cost-benefit analysis as well. We based that one on a published paper. They presented a cost-effective model. So we put our numbers into their calculated model to come up with a figure. And it came out cost neutral, which means that if you detect a baby, the amount of money that costs will at least be saved by the intensive care unit cost. And that is only short term. Because the one that have circulatory collapse, their risk of long-term morbidity.
Sure.
So
Antony,
I
your
think
comment.
oftentimes people who criticize the screening test is not cost effective, actually I think is guilty of not having sat down and done the math. And I think if you do the math, it's not even close that this is going to be cost effective. It's a relatively non-invasive test. It's not very costly. If we were to get it at our center, for instance, here at Children's Hospital Orange County, we get 5 to 10 babies a year that had a delayed diagnosis with all the morbidities and even mortality. So if you do the math just with those 5 to 10 babies, that easily can screen all the babies in Orange County several times over.
Anne-Marie, what's your take on the cost effectiveness of this intervention?
Well, there's just no question. I mean, you know, we have to talk to, you know, legislators about this all the time, but more importantly, it's the clinicians, it's the hospital associations, you know, and such that you need to present with data. But, you know, I think I hate to say this, but one of the drivers for the hospitals in implementing stuff like this is the liability risk. And you sort of hate to play that card, but quite frankly, those babies that are going home and coming back and collapse. I mean, I got a horrible phone call this morning of a baby in New York that was discharged at 3 days old, came back at 5 days old, hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Took 5 days to stabilize before they could do the surgery. 8 days on ECMO post-op. I mean, you know, the cost of 8 days on ECMO. I mean, and there still was very severe neurological damage, and you know, the baby just didn't make it.
So I think it's fair to say that the formal studies are still coming in. I think the UK have published some cost-effectiveness data, which supports what you've said, Anne-Marie. But we still need to have longer-term outcomes to build into those equations. I wanted to ask, given the overwhelming evidence, what's happening overseas, Anne-Marie, in terms of the introduction of pulse oximetry screening? Are you aware of what's happening in other countries?
We're doing a bit of work in other countries, and Anne might have some additional information too. But I think I'll go out on a limb here and say the UK is very close. Dr. Ewer's work is, you know, thorough and compelling.
It is.
And I know he's had to work very hard with the National Health Service there, but I think they're very close. We started some initial dialogue in South Africa as our NGO. And very recently I've been working closely with the Ministry of Health in China, which would, frankly, if we pull that off, and they would like to implement this as a population health screening in China, countrywide, and they have 60 million births a year, and I will tell you that will be the largest population health screening implementation in the world.
Sounds very exciting.
So let's fingers crossed for that. But it's a lot of work everywhere, wherever you try to implement. But it's key to have the government health officials on board. And our data out of Sweden, US, that's all been the reason they look at it.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Augusto, and I'm going to ask you about the slightly more recent evidence on oxygen targeting in very preterm babies, less than 28 weeks gestation. Just as background, Augusto, can you tell us a little bit about which babies receive supplemental oxygen in the neonatal intensive care unit? And what are the adverse effects of too much oxygen and too little oxygen?
Yes, with all due respect, first of all, I would like to thank Michael O'Reilly. I'm honored to be sitting beside these three people. And of course, Joe Chiani for having had this unbelievable original idea. And then I would like to ask for another 20 seconds. Being a neonatologist, I hear these people. I would like to add, if I may, a couple of things. We heard the mother of Cora. We heard her. You know, I understand pharmacoeconomics or whatever you want, but the emotional cost. So I believe that in this situation, just like the one you're going to ask me, the enemy has been us. Because I've been involved since Angranelli's work and working with Massimo to go around. And I can tell you, Canada, not England, the United States, the biggest opposers initially were the physicians. And I hate to say it, but sometimes the cardiologists. They say, we don't see that problem. So I believe that here, just like in oxygen, there is also a few other things to be done, which has to do with education and not just with trials. And if I may, good care has come from these people and others, and as you see, they are not randomized controlled trials. So good care in epidemiological work could come from many other things. And the problem is that so many people have got hooked into the fact of absence of evidence, so I don't know what to do. I think they need to know that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and these trials show it, and these mothers show it. So I'm sorry for this moving away of my topic, but it's something that I'm also become very involved. And by the way, technology. People have talked here about technology. No one has done any good study that shows that without this technology, you're going to be as efficient and effective in screening. And by the way, if I may add, Brazil is ready to pass a law. Brazil, I think it's going to be the first.
I'll take that.
Yeah, you knew that?
No, I'll get on the next plane.
Okay. Yeah, you have to. Okay, well, thank you. So about oxygen and who gets oxygen, it's a problem because, first of all, oxygen, as I think he alluded to, is a very potent potential poison and is one of the most frequently used drugs in neonatal care, short of vitamin K or cleaning the eyes. So there's no question that hypoxia, low oxygen, as he showed in recent randomized trials, if you get close or you definitely allow hypoxia, there will be an increased risk of death. We see that maybe not so much in developmental disabilities, but if it were worse hypoxia, that would be a problem. The issue is that we have all been taught this for decades, and still medical schools haven't changed this teaching, because hyperoxia is as bad as hypoxia. And that's where we got involved. So I can tell you that hyperoxia can lead to also developmental disabilities associated. It's associated, 3 minutes of oxygen, pure oxygen in the delivery room, has been associated in 2 large studies, one from Sweden, the other one from the United States, with cancer in childhood. Oxygen changes our genome, oxygen in excess, DNA, endocrine function. Interestingly enough, cardiac function is decreased by too much oxygen. Periventricular leukomalacia, cerebral palsy has been associated with too much oxygen. And actually, some people say that actually what we have done with our hands, people talked about our hands, and has been studied possibly inappropriately in animal studies or even in baby studies, is not the problem that was with hypoxia, but it's the treatment that we give, increase perfusion, and give much more oxygen to all the system. I think that those summarize briefly hypoxia and hyperoxia.
So just turning to the evidence that has just become available, how has that affected your own practice, Augusto, in terms of oxygen targets in these very preterm babies?
Yeah, as you saw, we looked to avoid hyperoxia initially, and hoping not to produce hypoxia. So we have several studies, and of course there are other people that have studied this. We never targeted in our practices 85 to 89%, and we will continue not to target it now, justified by the evidence. However, do we target 90 to 95? We are concerned. We are concerned because when we sit here, a lot of babies are receiving oxygen. A lot of alarms may be shut off, turned off. And the target range is a little too narrow. And it has been shown that babies, we may want that target, that's the intended target, but the actual oxygenation varies. And the higher you target, the higher the period of the day, period of time of the day, that the babies are in the hyperoxic range. So definitely we need to be against hypoxia. But I think the message should continue to be, we also need to be as obsessive with hyperoxia. So my answer to that is we need to eradicate bad practices. We still do not know the best practice. And this is where I have a problem with all these things, and we need to change our thought process. The best practice leads researchers to argue and argue and argue while babies and nurses are trying to take care of the babies. So we need to divide those two. And I believe it's much easier to agree in what is clearly a bad practice than to say, oh, I use the best practice. And in this case, we still don't know what it is. So in our case, we allow a larger target, and we set the alarms 1 to 3% lower than the targets and higher than the targets. And it depends on the baby. And I understand you're focusing on the tiny babies, but let me tell you, in neonatal care, there are many more babies that are not small. And that's an issue, right? We only have the studies on tiny babies. But there are many babies that are not small that are receiving oxygen, so the targets vary. I think they need to vary, and we use 88 to 93% on
Okay. Well, one of the points that's become very clear is it's very, very hard to actually control oxygenation in these little babies. Why do nurses have such a hard time? And might automatic FiO2 servo control be a contribution to trying to control oxygenation more effectively? And what about nurse-patient ratios? Yeah, you got any comments about those two?
Yeah, those are very good questions which are evolving. The so-called closed loop will decrease, based on recent studies, the staff efforts and time to maintain a baby within target. So mechanically, the system will detect when the baby goes above or below target, and it will decrease or increase the FiO2 accordingly without the nurse having to change it. So the evidence shows that within a certain range for these tiny babies, they spend less time in hyperoxia, but I'm concerned, and of course there has to be more studies, because they have spent more time between 80 and 86%.
Okay.
And that's where, you know, we shouldn't just say this will solve the problem, because at least not so far. But obviously it decreases nursing staff.
When we talk about the companies talking to each other, do you think that's maybe something for Massimo to be doing, talking to the people who make these servo control, FiO2 control? I don't know if that's happened already, but maybe that's something that could come out of this meeting. Because it's certainly true that the nurses have a very hard time in trying to control oxygen targeting.
Yeah, and by the way,
last-
I would like to ask the answer. The last question. Nursing spoke today, but it has been clearly shown what makes sense. That this issue of targeting and morbidities depend on many things: post-menstrual age, severity of the condition, and so on. FiO2 required. When the FiO2 is greater than 50%, the possibility of handling it is, or really reaching the target is less. But if you do not have, based on one very good study, nursing to patient ratio which is sufficient, then it's impossible. So that's part of the clinical change that needs to happen.
I think that's a very important point to finish on. We've got 10 seconds left. The nurse-patient ratio is one of the major determinants of accuracy of oxygen targeting. So I'd like to wrap up. We've run out of time. I'd like to wrap up by thanking our panel. It's been an extremely important insight, I think, into two performance gaps. And I'm privileged to have been on the same podium as all of you who've contributed so much to improving the outcome for these most vulnerable babies. So thanks very much indeed, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.